So this video is going to be looking at the sources that talk about the causes of the Catilinarian conspiracy. So we have a section of Sallust, two different speeches from Cicero, and a very short section of Plutarch as well. So the first source we're going to have a look at is this section of Sallust. Now we've previously looked at Sallust in the context of a couple of letters and a speech. So there was Mace's speech, and there was the letter from Pompey. So for both of those sources, he's also been quoting someone else. This section of the source, Sallust is just kind of writing his own version of what happened. Now, Sallust as a historian is interesting. I think I'll phrase it that way. He is one of our contemporary sources, so he was alive during these events. He actually was a friend of Caesar, and at some point, Sallust was actually exiled from Rome due to supposedly high levels of corruption. Now, Sallust in his book, somewhat ironically, is bemoaning the sort of collapse, as he saw it, of Rome's morals as a result of things like greed and corruption. He's kind of like the Daily Mail in respect of things were always better in the past, and now things are terrible. And this is some of the points that he makes in this particular part of the source. Is Romans before were really good, and now we're really bad. And every generation of Roman that's coming through is even worse than the previous ones, which is, like I said, it's very kind of Daily Mail-esque in its writing. But don't use that sort of evaluation, but you get my point. So he kind of sees Rome's kind of being doomed. And the book he writes about the Catilinarian conspiracy is basically being used as an example to show that Rome was doomed, that Rome was always going to collapse in on itself. And to be fair to Sallust, he probably was right. However, we must be careful about this kind of really negative view of the Republic that he has. And he really does not like Catiline, and he really doesn't like his supporters. What's really nice about this section is it also gives us some evidence for those kind of wider problems in the late Republic that we've talked about previously. Things about the empire growth, the impact of like Sulla, the problems with the economy, sort of social problems. So this gives us kind of really nice background to all of that, and actually gives you some quite straightforward quotes to use as well. So this part here is basically sort of saying Rome had taken over Carthage and then things started to go wrong, in a nutshell. And then he starts to talk about some of these kind of widespread issues as part of why the conspiracy occurred when it did. So, for example, he talks about the lust for money and then for power, and it starts to grow. It doesn't really need much explanation, quite a lot of what he says. Avarice destroyed honour and integrity. So avarice is like really corrupting, extreme greed. It goes beyond money. It's kind of greed for like everything. So saying, yes, there is this kind of like desire for money and wealth, but there's also this kind of avarice that goes even further than that kind of general low-level greed stuff. So people like are super greedy. So he's saying it's destroying everything. We've also got this idea that the Romans were neglecting the gods. They weren't being as pious and religious as before. There's this problem with ambition. People were making friends just for the personal self-gain, which if we think about the reasons why, the methods people used to get elected, and we talked about using amici and patrons and clients, that kind of fits in with that kind of attitude. It says the state was changed and a government once second to none equity and excellence became cruel and intolerable. So like the Senate and the assemblies and the cursus honorum, all of that was kind of was being horrible to its own citizens. And then if you think about the example of Sulla, that fits with that. So that is kind of a really broad sense of like everything's going really, really horribly wrong. And then he continues with this theme. It's a bit depressing, the source. For both the noble and the base is like the bottom of society, long for glory, honour and power. We know that was what Romans were after, particularly thinking about the importance of dignitas, which is kind of what this is basically referring to, but also power. He talks about Sulla having gained control of the state by arms brought everything to a bad end. We know that through the prescriptions. Obviously, he was a tyrannical dictator, and there was mass murder. you notice I'm skipping bits because I'm going to be honest, he goes on quite a lot about greed, and there's this section here is about more greed. Everybody's greedy, and if you're greedy, you want more money. So there's a bit of repetition. This is why I'm skipping over little bits. So, as I said, sort of makes everything worse. And then we have the idea that men are coveting a house, other lands. So there's sort of the growth of the estates that we know was a problem, especially by the aristocrats, were taking land off people and building these really nice houses and these large estates for sort of farming, etc. So there's some evidence for that as well. He also has a nice quote showing that Sulla, to ensure his own loyalty to the army, starts using kind of bribery, so allowed it a luxury indulgence. So giving them kind of like, nice things to kind of make sure they were loyal, which is obviously going to be part of the reason why the army was so loyal to him and not to the state. So that's obviously really bad. And it gives us some evidence about bribery and corruption. We've also got that the Roman people first learned to indulge women and drink, to admire statues, paintings, and embossed vases, I'm not American, sorry, to pillage shrines, to desecrate everything, both sacred and secular alike. So they're kind of being sort of lazy, indulgent, spending too much, drinking too much, womanizing too much, and then buying themselves pretty things, making nice houses, taking things from temples, desecrating everything, to going anti-religion. So it's like, literally, this is like a society absolutely tearing itself apart. Everybody's just out for themselves. Like I said, a little bit like the Daily Mail. He then sort of says that wealth came to be held in honour, so it's all about trying to get wealth, not about acting in the right way, which, considering what he was like exiled for, is somewhat ironic. Talks about the fact that military commands and political power becomes more important. It's not about virtue, it's not about doing the right thing, and poverty is now considered a disgrace. Again, if we think about the levels of debts that was going in the late Republic, particularly amongst those who were running for political office, would kind of explain why this poverty is now considered a disgrace, because obviously they need to get higher up to get rid of those debts. If they didn't get rid of the debts, eventually they would lose their estates and their houses, and that would have caused them huge levels of disgrace and loss of dignitas. So everything that Sallust is saying is a problem, and it is true. We know factually a lot of the stuff was happening, but whether it was happening quite to the extent that Sallust is pointing out is another issue. He's certainly emphasizing a lot of kind of moral, political, economic, and social problems. But like I said, that's the whole point of this book. So anyway, moving swiftly on, he then talks about that previously the Romans had sort of looked after the gods, which he mentions earlier, and instead of ruling the empire correctly, they now rule through oppression. So they're treating the provinces really badly, which again was true. Like I said in everything in previous lessons, once you had a provincial command and you were governor of a province, you would use that opportunity to wipe out your debts by just basically stealing everything. So again, there is this kind of evidence about this oppression going on. We've also got the fact that everybody basically is just having lots of sex, which he sees as being really dangerous. So they expand themselves more and more recklessly to every means of acquisition and expenditure. They're spending too much and having too much fun, basically. It talks about gluttony up here. They're eating whatever they want. They're sleeping, they don't need to sleep, but they're sleeping. So they're just being lazy. So the Romans are not these great people anymore. They're not like their ancestors. Now they are debased and corrupted and absolutely terrible. So this is the context of how Catiline was able to raise his army, which is the point he then starts to make. So in a city so great and corrupt, Catiline found it a very easy matter to surround himself. So then he talks about the kind of people that were supporting Catiline. So gangs of criminals and reprobates of every kind, so just terrible people. Anyone who bankrupted himself, anyone who's been convicted of murder or sacrilege, all hounded by disgrace, poverty, or even conscience. So basically, these are the dregs of society, I guess, as well as some aristocrats. Basically, those who are in debt and those who might be prosecuted for other things as well. And they seem to throw themselves behind Catiline because of the promises he was making. So one of the key promises he makes, which mentions in the source later on, is that he was going to cancel the debts. And he also, according to Sallust, was kind of promising people to have their charges removed, and that he was going to create this kind of more equal society. In order to ensure that he had the support, according to Sallust, he was using bribery and corruption. So he found mistresses for some, bought dogs and horses for others, which is quite a range of things. I guess if he bought me a dog, would I go on a massive conspiracy to overthrow the government? Probably not. But, you know, I think the point is it's about the corruption. And maybe it was a really good dog. I don't know, maybe it was like Lassie or something. I don't know. Anyway, so he's sort of using bribery to kind of create this kind of band of degenerates that are going to support him. He then talks a little bit about Catilin's background here. So the Catilinarian engaged in many shameful intrigues. So obviously we researched into Catilin's background, and you know the things that he was accused of doing. I should point out Catilin was never found guilty of any of these things. However, he was seemingly constantly being prosecuted for some pretty horrible acts. So he does have this kind of atmosphere around him of being a particularly unpleasant guy, which is basically what this section of the source is talking about. I haven't highlighted it. To be honest, it's not particularly relevant to what we're doing, but that's why Sallust has to bring it up, of course, because the people supporting Catilin are terrible and Catilin's even worse. So that's why Rome is doomed. So then he continues back to the story about how he's kind of trying to get people to support him. So he taught many forms of wickedness, whatever that means, supplied forgers and men to commit perjury. So again, it's this kind of corruption of the courts, corruption of evidence. So he's trying to get people found not guilty of these crimes in order for them to support him. Okay. He then, now he's got his supporters. This is kind of part of the plan. So this is going to be a quote you probably use quite a lot when talking about the Catilin conspiracy. So Catilin formed a plan of overthrowing the government. Beautiful. That's his main reason. Also, because of his own debts, he had a huge debt. In fact, why didn't I highlight enormous? Because he'd tried to run for consul 3 times and failed 3 times. His debts were huge. And that, to be honest, is part of the major reason why he wants to become the leader of Rome. Because obviously, once he's in charge, he can wipe everybody's debts, including his own, which is probably why someone do it. He also gets a large number of Sulla's veterans, so these are his ex-soldiers, because Sulla had given them land from the prescriptions and they had squandered the property. So they're eager for civil war. Another kind of factor of why it took place when it took place is the fact that Pompey was out in the east fighting Mithridates still. So that's why Catilin seems to launch it at this particular point. Catilin had tried to run for a consulship again, but had failed. And the Senate is totally unaware, completely oblivious to what is going on. So this, according to Sallust, is his chance to do it. Okay. Now he goes back in time. It's a bit frustrating about Sallust. He tends to jump around a little bit and talks about the fact that there was a previous conspiracy. So the Catilin conspiracy that we do can be known as the second Catilin conspiracy. There was a rumoured first one. Now, there's no evidence that there was a first conspiracy other than in Sallust. He's the only one who really mentions it. So was there another one? Possibly. There was certainly a rumour in Rome that he had tried to do it previously when the second, in inverted commas, conspiracy was found out. So this goes back to to the second conspiracy and when he was trying to run for his second consulship, I think, from memory. So he was charged with extortion. So he was, extorting someone, so using corruption. And at this point, he had been prevented from standing for the consulship because he was charged. You can't run for office, obviously, if you're under investigation, understandably. So he starts possibly to become involved in a plot. So we have a Gnaeus Piso, who needs funds to overthrow the government, of course. Who doesn't? So he then brings Catilin on side, and together they form together a conspiracy. And around the 5th of December, this is in about, I think, 65 BC from memory, to make preparations to kill the new consuls that come into place, who are these 2 men who we never talk about ever again. So the plot is discovered. So they then postpone it to the 5th of February. And this time they decide that they're going to plot not only to kill the consuls, but also lots of senators. So the plot kind of grows. But again, it fails at this point, because not enough conspirators join them. So it doesn't come to anything. Okay. This plot as well will be mentioned in Plutarch in relation to Caesar. So when we get to Plutarch, I'll re-explain it. Okay, so let me just tidy that up. There we go. Piso has a friendship with Crassus, so we've got the importance of amity, importance of friendships here in alliances. He's sent off to nearer Spain and gotten out of the way, so Crassus pulls a few strings to get him out of the city for whatever reason. And then the aristocracy kind of relax, even though there wasn't really proof that anything was really going to happen, because they believed that Piso could be used against Pompey because they're really worried about Pompey. Just some evidence there, to be honest, about the power of Pompey at this particular point. So, as I said, nothing really comes of it at this particular point. Piso is then killed, and then sort of a year and a half later, Catiline tries again. Okay, so we then come back to the story of the Catiline conspiracy. So he then starts to address them as a group and encourage them. So this is quite a nice section about the importance of rhetoric. So the importance of using speeches to convince people to join or do whatever you want them to do. And in this particular speech, which is from Catiline, in fact, I will highlight the fact that it's Catiline speaking. There we go. He is basically justifying his reasons for the conspiracy. Now, we know the real reasons behind it, but these are the ones that he is going to give. So he's going to say, I'll have the opportunity to speak, this is what I'm going to say. So he said, when I consider under what conditions we shall live if we don't do it. So in other words, a lot of these people will be put in prison because they've got debts, etc. The state came under jurisdiction and sway of a few powerful men. So basically, he's saying that the people, my people, because he sees himself as kind of like the champion of the lower classes, we are basically being disenfranchised by the Senate and some key aristocrats, and that's the problem with us. So, all the rest of us are but a crowd of nobodies without influence or authority. So you've all been left behind, and it's absolutely terrible. Now, all influence, power, rank, and wealth are in their hands. To us, they've left danger, defeat, prosecutions, and poverty. So this is like a really rousing speech to make the people supporting him really angry. Okay, and he goes on with the same kind of story. So they have two or more houses joined together. We have not a home to call our own. We have destitution at home and debt everywhere. So we are ignored. We're being treated really badly by the Senate and sort of the upper classes. We have huge debts no one's helping us with. We have no chances. This is why we're doing it. Now, here, before your eyes is the freedom for which you've longed, and with it riches, honour, and glory. So in other words, we're going to improve our situation. I hope to help you carry out as your consul. So this kind of gives you a bit more of a clue of the reasons why he's really doing it, which is to get power. It's not about actually, promising, helping them really. So then he talks about his promises. So then Catiline promised them the cancellation of debts. So there's a clear reason for the conspiracy, the proscription of the rich, offices, priesthoods, plunder, and all the other spoils that would come from a war. So you take, the estates and the money off the rich and give to the people. It's kind of Robin Hood, I guess, but less really in it for the people. So obviously at this point, Piso wasn't yet dead, so he's in nearer Spain. And then we also have, he states that, yes, Piso's on my side. We also have a couple of people, to be honest, Citius and Citius isn't particularly important. The fact is that it has an army and that they're also accomplices, so he has power as well. We have another guy called Antonius, is a really close friend of his, who is also a consul at this point, so he could sort of use him as his cooperation. And you remind them either of their poverty or of their ambition. So it's kind of like two things kind of going on. Well, three things really of the causes. There's this poverty issue, there's this debt issue, there's this quest for glory, and it's all because Rome was so terrible that leads to the conspiracy launching at this particular point. So then we move on to a section of Cicero's speech. So in Latin, it basically means the law of land. That's what it translates as. So it's about a land law that was being debated at this particular point. And basically, Cicero was, he was an optimate, and he believed that the land law that was being debated, which would have given kind of basically land to the poor, wouldn't have helped the situation. Now, Cicero saw himself as like the people's, the people's consul. Sounds so stupid. And that's because he was elected over, to be honest, over Catiline. And this is part of the other reason why Catiline launches his conspiracy. So, Cicero was a novus homo. He has no political background. His family has no political background. He's slowly worked his way up through the cursus honorum. He's made his fortune. He's made his name being a lawyer. And he went for the consulship and he was elected first time. Now, at that consular election, Catiline was going for the third attempt and failed. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in another source. So Cicero kind of saw that the people decided to support him, and some of the nobles had thrown their weight behind Cicero as well. So he was like the consul of the people. He was for them, even though he was an optimate. And that's why he's arguing against the landlord. He's kind of playing on his "I am one of you, I am for you. This landlord won't help you at all," to sort of argue against the law, and the law doesn't pass at this particular point. However, he is also talking about some of the kind of problems that were going on in Rome. So here we've got how he was an elected consul when universal over people. That kind of shows that he sees him as the people's consul. He also talks about that there's the use of rhetoric to get some supporters, which is also quite dangerous, which is hilarious because he's using exactly the same thing. And Cicero is like the king of rhetoric. In fact, his rhetoric teachings are still studied today. He is known as the greatest orator in history. Now, when you read his speeches, you probably think, not really feeling it, Kay, because they're a little bit boring. And they can be in places, I'm not going to lie. But in person, I'm sure they were fantastic. And it's the methods he uses in the rhetoric is what is still taught today, and it's known as kind of like Ciceronian rhetoric, to be precise. Fun facts for you there. Anyway, he talks about some wider problems. So there's anxiety and fear. There's seditious plots against the present form of government. So this is kind of obviously referring to like the Catiline conspiracy. I knew what was going on, and I declared it in the Senate. As long as held office, I will be the people's consul. Of course he will be. I'm going to skip quite a lot of his speech because he just rambles on about like I'm going to bring peace. He also talks about some dangers about proclaiming some largesse, which can be promised in works but cannot possibly in reality be given without draining the treasury. So largesse, this word here, is kind of like gifts or nice things you do for the people. So they can be like festivals, grain, the giving out of money to gifts. It's not bribery, really, but it's kind of used like bribery, if you see what I mean. It's not like proper bribery. Largesse was really common in Roman politics. You'd give out food to supporters to make yourself really popular. So he's kind of saying that this giving of the land under this bill would be like largesse, and it would basically cost too much money, it would drain the treasury, and that's why it won't help you in the long run, and it would cause some major problems. So again, it's just about this kind of context about there is some agitation about giving really poor people land, because Rome basically had become full of unemployed people. So all these people had kind of like left the provinces because land's been taken off them with the estates, like we saw for the Gracchi brother stuff, flooded into Rome to try and find employment. So that's why this land bill is being discussed. It's the idea that you'd give the land to these people to get them out of the city. This is not going to be the last time we hear of this kind of land bill. And he's basically saying that this land bill looks good, but actually it's being used just to win your support for some key people, and it's not actually going to solve your particular problem. And that's why the land bill wasn't passed, but it gives you this kind of wider context of other problems that were going on in Rome. Whew. Anyway, this is going to be a long one, sorry. So then we have another Cicero speech. So this speech is specifically against Catiline. So this speech is given during Cicero's consulship. Now, during Cicero's consulship, obviously the elections for the next consuls go ahead, because the Romans basically elect a year in advance, which is really confusing, but hey. So Catiline runs for yet another consulship. And during his campaigning, Cicero, as consul, gave a series of speeches. This isn't the speech I'm referring to right now. Now, during one of those speeches, Cicero wore a steel breastplate under his toga and ensured that it fell open slightly, and people could see the breastplate under his toga. And the reason why he did that is he was trying to infer that if Catiline was successful, there would be danger to the Republic and that he would cause massive problems. And he gives a series of speeches against Catiline, against other people, well, specifically against Catiline, with his breastplate, and it works. And Catiline it fails to get elected, and that's when he launches the conspiracy. Now, during the conspiracy, obviously, rumours start to fly that Catiline is gathering forces, and Cicero then gives a series of speeches sort of against Catiline, and also to raise awareness of some of the problems, because he's aware that obviously they're probably at this point he's not aware of like the extent of the problem, as in he doesn't know there's going to be like an army raised and they're going to attack the city, but he is aware that Catiline is building up some supporters outside of the city. They don't really know what's going to happen next. So Cicero's speech basically goes through, as it says here, the different groups that make up Catiline's forces. And being a Cicero speech, it tends to repeat itself a little bit, and you'll spot a theme that comes through the key groups. But this gives you quite a nice overview again of some of the problems, some of the things that people were facing, and kind of reinforces what Sallust had said earlier. So the first group are those who are steeped in debt. And says, but they refuse to pay off their debts because they love their land too much. How dare they? And they seem really honourable, but they're not, because actually they're really full of debt and they're really shameless and they're not willing to give up their land. So perhaps you await a list announcing a general cancellation of debts, which is also what Catiline was promising. Those who expect this from Catiline are fools. So he says, I'll publish a list, but there will be lands they're going to sell, and that will pay your debts off. So don't be ridiculous. Don't kind of grasp onto someone like Catiline who's making false promises. Just sell your land, sell your property, and pay off your own debts. The second group are also debtors, but these ones are slightly different debtors. So these ones are just kind of desperate. These guys expect to rule. So these guys want to be in government and they want to seize power. And they think civil war, get it? And he says, I'm aware of you guys and I'm watching over the state. I am the protector. I'm the father of the state. I will look after you. So basically that's what this is talking about. Then we have a third group. So these guys are older, but they're tough. And these come from Sulla's colonies. So this is quite common for military leaders to set up colonies of ex-veterans, but also local people. And under Sulla, they had lots of prosperity, but they've spent it all. So now they are also in debt, and they're not likely to become solvent. So he calls them freebooters and scavengers. So basically, they want to take over in order to, funnily enough, pay off their debts, but get rich again. We then have a fourth group who are, great quote this, a motley and seditious crew who are also debted. And these guys are just basically really horrible and pretty unpleasant, but they're in debt, so they want to avoid being put under trial, and that's why they've fled to Catiline. Our fifth group is just murderers and cutthroats and criminals, so they're just charming. And then finally, the sixth group are his friends. So they devote their lives and their waking hours to the vast labour of banqueting all night. They want dinner parties, gambling and adultery. An adulterer. And he found... it's found the gambler and the adulterer. That makes more sense. And the filth of Rome. So these are his actual friends. And they're just really unpleasant. And basically saying, if you don't deal with these guys, it's because these guys, they are a breeding ground for future Catilines. So it's not just him that's dangerous. It's also his close friends who are also very dangerous. And this is kind of, again, debt is a big issue. I think you're picking up here. All about debt. Everything's about debt. Right, so then we have, I'm just scrolling all the way down, that's what I thought. So this section of Plutarch Caesar. Now, the first part you're going to think is not particularly relevant, and you'll be right. It's not particularly relevant to the Catiline conspiracy, but it's one of these sources that I couldn't put anywhere else because it doesn't make the second half of the source makes no sense without the first half of the source. So this gives you a little bit of background about Caesar's position in Rome, as in Julius Caesar, the infamous Julius Caesar. I can't remember the dates off the top of my head when this is happening. What we do have is the chief priest in Rome died. Now, the chief pontiff is known as the Pontifex Maximus, which quite literally translates as like biggest priest. So the chief priest, the Pontifex Maximus, controlled basically Roman religion. They looked after all of the main priesthoods, and there's like I think 12 different priesthoods. And you are elected for life to be chief priest, the Pontifex Maximus. They are elected. And as part of it, you get a really nice house in the centre of Rome. So you're right at the centre of power. So Caesar, at this particular point, decides to put himself as a candidate. Now, the other candidate was a guy called Catullus, who basically was probably going to win. People assumed it was going to be a win. And but Caesar decides he wants to run. Now, Catullus obviously becomes quite worried about this because Caesar was quite popular. So he tries to bribe him. So we've got some really good evidence here about bribery in the Republic, to tell him basically to stand down. And Caesar says, no, I'm going to do it. And I'll do it even if I have to borrow more money than you in order to win the election, whether that's through like bribery himself or through using the patrons and the clients or the rest of it. Doesn't really matter. Okay, fine. Caesar wins the election, so he becomes Pontifex Maximus. This is quite important later on in the course. And this makes the Senate really worried that he's going to lead the people forward on a course of violent extremism. Plutarch always says this about Caesar, like, he does this in order to be king. It's not true. At this point, there's quite a big gap between what happens here and when the civil war that comes later. Spoiler alert. But Plutarch can't help make the point because Plutarch really hates Caesar. Okay, so you're thinking, what's this got to do with Catiline? To be honest, nothing really, until we get to this bottom paragraph. So this is why Piso and Catullus found fault with Cicero for having spared Caesar when, at the time of Catiline's conspiracy, he had given his enemies a hold over him. Interesting. So basically, it's all to do with the aftermath of the Catiline conspiracy. Now, there's a really nice quote here about the Catiline and what he was planning. So Catiline planned not only to overthrow the constitution, but destroy the whole government. Great, you'll use that quote. It's an easy one to remember. And there are some rumours that Caesar was involved in the Catiline conspiracy. Now, the reason why these rumours circulate is because of this bit down here. It says all the other senators, until it came to turn of Caesar, were in favour of the death penalty, but Caesar rose up in a long, carefully worded speech, objected to this, because it was unprecedented and unjust to put to death without trial men of high rank. Now, we will read Caesar's speech later. Well, not in this video, obviously, but later on when we look at the aftermath of the Catiline conspiracy. Now, because Caesar wasn't defending the conspirators, he was just saying that the process they were going to do was illegal. And to be honest, Caesar was right. People took that to mean that Caesar must have been the supporter of Catiline. Now, Plutarch mentions this because Plutarch doesn't like Caesar. So therefore, in his mind, the only reason why Caesar would say this was because he supported Catiline, because Catiline was power-hungry and horrible. Caesar, in accordance with Plutarch, was power-hungry and horrible. So therefore, they wanted the same thing. There were also a few rumours of the first Catiline conspiracy that Caesar was involved in the first one. Like I said, there's no evidence of this, but it is mentioned. So this is why Plutarch mentions it. And obviously Catullus is unhappy because he'd lost the election here about the Pontifex Maximus, and then Cicero had spared Caesar. Cicero didn't spare Caesar at all. The Senate voted against Caesar. It was nothing to do with Cicero, to be honest. Well, no, it wasn't to do with Cicero, but it wasn't like Cicero's fault. And it wasn't like Caesar had done anything illegal giving this speech. So again, this bit of Plutarch definitely shows up his prejudices against Catiline. But anyway, and then it sort of talks about the end and it gets a bit confusing. So hopefully that kind of explains some of the wider problems in the Republic. We've also got the specific reasons, for Catiline's motive, for the conspiracy, and also the motives behind his 6 groups, according to Cicero, of supporting the conspiracy.